The usual advice for avoiding heart disease is to eat a low-fat diet with plenty of whole grains and substitute vegetable oils for saturated animal fats. But does that advice really fit with human biology? Let's start with one simple idea. Mother Nature isn't stupid. She didn't make human beings the only species on Earth who prefers foods that will kill us. So what do human beings naturally like to eat?
Your natural preference is for things that are salty, things that are sweet, and things that are fatty. You have those three native desires for good reason. Those are the things that are good for you. That's where the nutrients that you need are located.
In nature, sweet means fruit, along with certain vegetables like carrots, and those are good for you. Fats occur naturally in foods like olives and nuts, but for most of human history, the biggest source of fat was saturated animal fat, which is fatty and salty. Yum, yum. And for millions of years, this is exactly how we ate. We ate no sugar, almost no starch, a little bit of vegetable fat, and a whole lot of saturated animal fat, up to 5 or even 10 times as much as the experts say we should. But almost nobody got heart disease.
If you look at pre-agricultural humans, at their skeletal remains, the cortical thickness of their bones, they're robust, they're tall, they had good teeth. When societies became agricultural and we became short of stature, tooth decay became rampant, infections were rampant. Human health devolved when we adopted agriculture.
If you could pack all of human history into 1 year, we've only been farming and eating grain since about yesterday, which is when we became shorter and fatter. We only started consuming processed vegetable oils about 10 minutes ago, which is when heart disease became our #1 killer. So after examining all this human history, the experts came to the obvious conclusion. We need to eat a lot more of these. And so they convinced us that human health depends on foods we didn't eat for more than 99% of our entire existence. How did this happen? In the 1950s, a biochemist named Ancel Keys published a study that compared heart disease and fat consumption in a half-dozen countries. The more fat, the more heart disease. The trend line was unmistakable. Just one little problem. Keys left out countries where people eat a lot of fat but have very little heart disease, like Holland and Norway. He also left out countries where people don't eat much fat but do have a lot of heart disease, like Chile. In fact, Keys had reliable data from 22 countries, and the results were all over the place. But you can't make a big splash in the scientific community with a trend line that looks like this. So Keys did what any dedicated researcher would do. He threw out the data that didn't fit and published his results. His punishment for this bit of scientific chicanery was to get his picture on the cover of Time magazine. Keys became known as the father of the lipid hypothesis, which says that eating saturated fat raises the cholesterol in your blood, and high cholesterol in your blood clogs your arteries and causes heart disease.
The hypothesis that when you eat high fat, that produces high cholesterol, and the cholesterol produces heart disease, is wrong in every one of those links.
This whole idea that dietary fat causes cholesterol problems is sort of a myth. The whole idea that cholesterol problems lead to heart disease is a myth.
The theory is completely and totally wrong. It was a theory that was made out of whole cloth and then pushed.
The term artery clogging saturated fat, it's as though it's all one word.
It's become part of the zeitgeist. Everybody knows saturated fat is bad for you, but when you get back and you start looking at the medical literature and you root back through to find out where this whole idea came from, it's bogus.
3 authors who did root through the medical literature are science writer Gary Taubes, Swedish doctor Uffe Ravenskov, and British doctor Malcolm Kendrick. When they examined the data from all the big studies on heart disease, they discovered some pretty interesting facts. Here's my favorite. Guess how many studies actually prove that a high-fat diet causes heart disease? The answer? 0. That's right, none. In some of the largest studies ever conducted, researchers put thousands of volunteers on a low-fat diet and then tracked their health history for several years. The results? Nothing. They had just as many heart attacks as people who weren't on a low-fat diet. Since 1948, the Harvard Medical School has been following the diets and death rates of the entire population of Framingham, Massachusetts. One of the researchers involved in the Framingham study called the lipid hypothesis the greatest scientific scam of this century, perhaps of any century. And after more than 40 years, even the director of the study made a rather startling admission about what the study data actually shows. The more saturated fat one ate, the more cholesterol one ate, the lower the person's serum cholesterol. In other words, a high-fat diet does not automatically raise your cholesterol. Well, what about the second half of the lipid hypothesis? Whether it comes from your diet or not, doesn't high cholesterol cause heart disease? After all, that's what the experts have been telling us for 50 years.
Lots of people have bad heart attacks and have low cholesterol. There's not really a huge correlation there.
You've got people who have heart attacks and who develop plaque who have high cholesterol, people who have low cholesterol. There's really not any correlation.
Michael DeBakey, the famous heart surgeon, compared the medical records of more than 1,700 of his own patients. He found no relationship between cholesterol levels and heart disease. When Dwight Eisenhower had his first heart attack, his cholesterol was only about 165. Wow, that's a nice healthy level there, General. So if high cholesterol doesn't actually cause heart disease, what does?
The newest theories in heart disease development don't have anything to do with cholesterol. They have to do with inflammation.
Cholesterol does not cause heart disease. Cholesterol is the thing that heart disease acts upon. The heart disease is the inflammation and the oxidation, the plaquing out of cholesterol once it becomes oxidized.
So many people have been found that have low, normal or low cholesterol, and they still have bad heart disease. But most of those people, when they're checked carefully, will have signs of inflammation.
To understand how inflammation can cause heart disease, let's look at what cholesterol actually does. Cholesterol is one of the most important substances in your body. Without it, you'd be dead. Your brain and your nervous system are full of cholesterol. The walls of your cells depend on cholesterol. Nearly all of your hormones are made from cholesterol. This stuff is so important, almost every cell in your body can make its own cholesterol if it has to. The heart disease story we all know goes like this. If you have too much LDL or bad cholesterol, it builds up in your arteries and makes them narrow. But if you're lucky, HDL, or good cholesterol, gobbles it up and clears it away. It's a nice, simple story. And it's a load of baloney. For one thing, LDL and HDL are not cholesterol. They're proteins that carry cholesterol through your blood. LDL carries cholesterol from your liver to your tissues, and HDL carries old cholesterol back to your liver where it's recycled. If you want more HDL, the last thing you need is a low-fat diet.
What makes HDL go up? Fat in the diet. That's what raises HDL. So you increase the fat in your diet, and your HDL, deemed by even the most fervent anti-cholesterol person as the good cholesterol, HDL goes up.
That's right. In spite of what the experts told us, 27 different studies have shown that eating saturated fat raises your HDL. And despite its bad reputation, not all LDL is actually bad.
LDL comes in different size packages. They're little small, dense, BB-like packages, and there are big, round, fluffy, cotton ball-like packages. And the small, dense ones, it turns out, what's called the type B LDL, are the most harmful ones. And the big, fluffy ones aren't particularly harmful at all.
Heart disease doesn't begin when your cholesterol goes up. It begins when your arteries become damaged or inflamed. LDL then does exactly what it's supposed to do. It brings in cholesterol to help the healing process. But if small LDL becomes damaged by oxidation, it can penetrate the wall of the artery. If the inflammation and oxidation continue, a plaque begins to form. Now you've got heart disease. So does a high-fat diet produce too much small LDL? Nope. Small LDL is the result of eating too many carbohydrates.
That's been shown in the medical literature probably a dozen times at least in papers that reducing carbohydrate in the diet shifts from a small dense pattern to a big fluffy pattern.
Having an LDL that's 120 or 130 or 100 or 145 doesn't matter as much as the kind of LDL that it is.
If the numbers alone don't mean very much, then why does high cholesterol get all the blame? Research consistently shows that smoking, elevated blood sugar, and emotional stress can cause inflammation, damage your arteries, and lead to heart disease. They also happen to raise your cholesterol. So by blaming cholesterol for causing heart disease, the experts relied on logic that makes about as much sense as this. In high crime areas, there are more calls to the police. Therefore, we can assume that calling the police produces an increase in crime. To get rid of crime, the answer is simple. Stop calling the police. But in spite of all the evidence that cholesterol is just an innocent bystander, the experts keep trying to bring it up on charges.
There's a reasonable reason to believe that from the beginning. But to persist in the face of so much overwhelming evidence really can't be based on science, and you have to think that there were other factors involved. It became an industry.
In the 1980s, the National Cholesterol Education Program released new guidelines that said everyone's cholesterol should be below 200, which was about 20 points below normal. And here's a strange coincidence. Most of the scientists who wrote those guidelines just happen to have a financial relationship with the companies that make cholesterol-lowering drugs called statins. Many of the studies that claimed a low-fat diet is good for your heart were funded by the American Heart Association, which earns millions of dollars licensing its Heart Check logo to healthy low-fat foods like Cocoa Puffs. If the lipid hypothesis ever goes away, that logo just became worthless.
Give this another decade, and that hypothesis will be on the junk pile of history because it's not true.
Okay, so maybe the lipid hypothesis isn't true. So what? What could possibly be wrong with cutting back on saturated fat and getting your cholesterol as low as possible?
We now have this terrible phobia of fat, of animal fat, which the body needs to be normal, to be healthy.
Your immune system is fat dependent. I mean, your brain is fat dependent. Your skin, your hair, your nails, all these things are fat dependent. Your sex hormones are fat dependent, are cholesterol dependent. They're made sort of on a cholesterol molecule.
If you are elderly, over the age of 60, and if you're a woman of any age, the cholesterol is a complete non-issue. In fact, the higher your cholesterol, the longer you live. And this shows up in study after study.
And yet, in spite of those studies, drugs that lower cholesterol are being marketed to women. But take a good look at that little disclaimer. If it doesn't prevent heart disease, why on earth would you take such a powerful drug?
There is absolutely no benefit for women of any age in taking statins. I mean, statins are a waste of money for women.
There's some real problems with taking statins. Memory loss, muscle problems, and osteoporosis in women. I mean, there are a lot of reasons that you wouldn't want to take statin drugs.
And low cholesterol is a predictor for depression, suicide, violent behavior, strokes, and cancer. It's much better to have high cholesterol than lower cholesterol.
Like most people, I love the taste of fat. Human beings can't live without protein, and in nature, protein is usually surrounded with fat. Maybe Mother Nature actually knew what she was doing. Maybe there's a reason low-fat diets always made me feel depressed.
The brain is basically made of fat. They say you're a fathead, they were not kidding. And when you go on a diet that eliminates most fat, takes you down to say 10% of fat, you have basically robbed the body of the raw materials that are necessary for it to be happy.
There's probably no coincidence that back a couple of decades ago when the low-fat diet was the real rage, if you went to bookstores, what you saw is all these books on low-fat diet, and you saw all these books on depression because everybody was depressed.
When I load up on proteins and animal fats, I don't feel hungry and I do feel good. So on this diet, I'm ignoring the experts. Look at all that saturated fat. Go on a shopping trip at your local natural food store and you'll find the shelves jam-packed with processed vegetable oils. But what exactly is natural about them? Would human beings living in the wild ever consume oils that came from soybeans or corn?
We've never had these in the human diet in the history of the world.
Where do you get fat from corn? If you take corn and put it in a thing and squeeze it, you don't get corn fat out of it. You don't get corn oil. You've got to chemically extract the oil from corn to get it.
Until that process was developed, you didn't have all of these vegetables, soybean oil and corn oil and cottonseed oil and all these things. Humans didn't eat that stuff.
The studies that came in on the corn oil showed that it was a disaster, that it caused cancer. If you gave carcinogens to rats who were fed corn oil, they developed cancer. If the rats were fed coconut oil or tallow, they didn't get cancer.
And it's not just cancer. After the experts convinced millions of Americans to switch from butter and lard to margarine and vegetable oils, heart disease went up. How can that be? After all, vegetable oils are cholesterol-free.
We as humans are not used to eating those fats in the quantities that we've been eating them. I mean, that's what's called an omega-6 fat. Omega-6 fats are pro-inflammatory. They cause inflammation. We need some of them, but we don't need a whole lot of them.
But we do eat a whole lot of them, and those unnatural fats can cause the inflammation that leads to heart disease. Especially the most unnatural fat of all, partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, otherwise known as trans fats.
It gives you the cooking properties you need, the flakiness in biscuits and the chewiness in bread and the things that you look for from a saturated fat. But it doesn't behave as a saturated fat in the body, and the body actually will take it up very readily and pack it into the cell membranes, which then become stiff and inflexible and can't do their job.
The Center for Science in the Public Interest recently filed a lawsuit against KFC for using trans fats to fry chicken. And pretty much everyone agrees that trans fats are bad news. So why do the restaurants even use them?
The old McDonald's French fries, for example, were cooked in beef tallow, which is a saturated fat that's got lots of stearic acid in it. Stearic acid is a long-chain saturated fat that's been shown to actually either lower or have no effect on cholesterol. It's a pretty innocuous fat.
They had very well-publicized, very carefully orchestrated protests outside of McDonald's and the other fast food chains.
Took out petitions and went after them. And they made them change. And what they made them change to, of course, was partially hydrogenated vegetable fat. And he came up with one of his papers which said trans fatty acids not guilty as charged, and distributed all of this. Here is the head of the CSPI. And they're still in their journals. In other words, all you have to do is go take a look at it, and they said trans fatty acids not guilty as charged.
So their big jihad to get rid of saturated fat ended up making everybody switch to trans fats.
Somebody evidently said to them, "You're wrong, there's something wrong with the trans fatty acids," and they did an about-face.
Now, the same group, the CSPI, is going after people for using trans fats, and they're only using the trans fats because they went after them for using the saturated fats in the first place.
And they lied, and they said, "Oh, we've been telling you all along that the trans fatty acids were a problem." And they just simply lied.
Apparently, believing that people were basing their diets on $10 buckets of movie popcorn, CSPI scared people away from a perfectly natural, healthy fat.
The study found 70% of all theaters tested still popping with high-fat coconut oil.
The scare was invented by Center for Science in the Public Interest, who, by their own admission, was being supported by the soy industry.
It's a saturated fat, but it's a good kind of saturated fat. It's got lauric acid in it, which is a good sort of immune-enhancing saturated fat. I mean, there's nothing in the world wrong with coconut oil.
They wanted the movie theaters to use partially hydrogenated soybean oil instead of coconut oil.
And what does it get replaced with? Trans fats that are much worse.
Thanks to the experts, the politicians, and the radical vegetarian nutcases, we've been scared away from perfectly natural animal fats that kept us healthy for millions of years. We scared men away from saturated fat, which helps to produce testosterone, and now we take Viagra. We scared parents into giving their kids skim milk while their brains are growing, and now we've got kids who can't concentrate and take drugs for ADD. And worse, the experts convinced us to switch to highly processed and completely unnatural fats that cause inflammation, weaken our cells, and make us sick.
This was all being pushed and advocated by people that Americans trusted, by our government, by people wearing white coats, scientists and doctors. And they were wrong. They were simply wrong, and we are reaping the whirlwind of the consequences today.